Hello, this is the video, or set of videos, I should say, for Chapter 12, more on GUI controls. I'm going to try and keep these videos short. I don't want to take much time out of your busy day, and I think that the best way to learn the material in Chapters 12 and 13 about GUI controls and the events associated with them is to just create your own GUIs and forms and just play around with the different properties and controls and explore and see what everything does. There's dozens of controls and hundreds of properties. I can't possibly teach you how to use all of them, but most of them are fairly intuitive. Once you learn how to work with controls and properties in general, then it's fairly straightforward and easy to explore additional controls and properties. And you can find the lists of them right there in Visual Studio as well as in the tables in the textbook. So for this chapter, as I mentioned, we're going to learn more about controls. I'm going to split this into two short videos. In the first video, we're going to work a little more with control properties, such as fonts, colors, and text. And then in the second video, I will build a little application that uses some additional controls. We're familiar with text boxes, buttons, and labels if you've been following my videos. And we're going to add some other controls and add some diversity to our toolset. And we'll also look at how to control the layout of your form. Okay, so every control has a set of properties, dozens, if not over 100 properties. There are several controls, such as the ones shown on the screen, that are common to, or excuse me, there are several properties shown on, like the ones shown on the screen, that are common to every type of control. So every control, whether it's a text box, label, combo box, calendar, has these properties. And again, I'm not going to sit here and read these to you or explain every single one. I'd encourage you to skim these, get familiar with what the possibilities are, what you can do with them. One thing we'll go over is, for example, the background color. You can change the background color of any control. We will come back in part 2 of the video. I'll talk about the anchor and dock properties, which controls where on the form your controls are. We're going to look at fonts in this video. We already know about the name property of a control. And we've already looked at the text and visible properties. You have size property. We're going to be looking at tab index and tab stop, I think, in the chapter 13 videos. Everything else, feel free to explore on your own. So first, setting a controls font. The font class is a predefined class that you can use in C# to change the appearance of printed text on your forms. So the font isn't just like a single, it isn't just about the font type, the typeface, but the font property includes several parts. And so it's actually a font object that includes the font type, the font style, the font size. And just like any other property, one thing I want you to get out of this video is every single property in C# in Visual Studio, you can edit using the properties window, which we've done throughout this semester. That changes the default properties, what appears on the screen when the user very first opens up your form. And every single one of these properties can also be changed in the code, just like we've changed the text of a label in our code. We can change the font of any control, or the size of any control, or the visibility of any control, or any other property in our code. So here's an example of changing a font in the code. You have to declare a font object. So system.drawing.font, give it a name, declare it as a new font object, and then in the parentheses you have to specify the typeface and the size Okay, so here we've created a font object called big font, and then we have assigned that font object to the font property of a label or to the font property of a button. There's a lot of pieces, a lot of keywords, and a lot of input parameters to remember when creating a font. You don't need to memorize this. That's why I've included it in these slides so that you can have as a reference. Most of the time, though, I would think that fonts are something that you set in the default properties box. It isn't usually like you click a button and the font on something changes. But I did just want to share that concept in that example that every single property of a control, even the ones that you think you would only change the default settings in the properties box, can also be changed in the code. So the possibilities are endless. The sky is the limit. I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio. And in fact, I'm not even going to go through this process of changing a font in the code. I'll just leave that the code in the slides there for you. But in this example that I'll share, I'll just show you so that everyone's up to speed on changing the font in the properties box. So if I add a label to this form, I've created a brand new form. I just called it Fun with Colors and Fonts because we're just going to be playing around with some properties. It's not really an application that does a lot. I'm going to have this label say choose a background color. Or instead of choose, I'm going to have it say type a background color. And yeah, here in the properties box, if I find the font property, so you'll notice that it has a little plus to the left of the font property. What that means is that unlike most of these properties that just hold a single value, like the text property holds a single text. Oops, my little red circle's not going away. There we go. The visible property holds a single value, either true or false. But these properties that have a plus next to them are actually the property is an object with multiple attributes. So for example, if we click on the plus sign next to the font name, it will expand and you can see different attributes of the font that you can change. So you can change the typeface, the size, bold, underline, italic, all the font, standard font attributes. Okay, I'm going to add a text box. So the user is going to be able to type in a background color, and then when we hit the button, the color of our application is going to change. The text box, you notice that we can change the size of controls visually on the screen. I've been doing that all semester. But what that actually does is it changes the code in the background that sets the size property. So you can manually set the size of a control as well, the height, width, and height. And that is also a property that you can change in the code. It's just as easy as looking up the documentation on how to do it. Changing most of these properties is pretty straightforward. I'm going to change the name of this text box to color text box. And I could change the font here as well. It won't really appear on the screen. It will just change the font of what of whatever text the user types into that text box. I don't even know what that font looks like. It'll be a surprise when I run the application. And I'm going to add 2 buttons. One of them is going to be the form color button. And we'll have it say change the background color. And the other one I will call the button color button. And it will say change the color of this button. Just a silly example. So I showed you about forms. Now let's talk about colors. So just like the font is a class that has several properties, color is a class as well. And it contains a wide variety of predefined colors that you can use. I've got just a very small partial list of colors here. There's a bigger list in the textbook, and of course, all the documentation for C# and Visual Studio Colors is online on Microsoft's websites. So changing the color of something, most, if not all, controls have a property called back color and a property called fore color. And you can set those to a certain color just by typing the control dot the property, just like when we set any value to a controls property, we type the control name dot the property name, and that what we want to set that to is system dot drawing dot color dot, and then there's a predefined list of colors that are built in to this class. I'm going to jump back to Visual Studio. I'm actually just going to check in my code view. So we've already got system.drawing specified as a namespace. So we should be able to just use the color.blue. So this form is going to allow the user to change the color. If they click on this button on the left, it will change the color of the whole thing. If they click the button on the right, it will change color just of that button, and I'll show you how to do each of those in the code. So if we double click on this button, we're first going to check what the user input. And I'm going to use a series of if statements. So for example, if the user put blue, whoops, if the text input is blue, then what we can do is set the form's back color property to be color.blue. So when you want to refer to a control, we know that we state the control's name and then the period and then the property name. If the control that you want to change the property for is the form itself, you use the keyword this. So when you type this, it means it's referring to this outside class. So it's talking about the form's properties rather than a specific control's properties. So this keyword refers to this form, and then if you type period, you can see it has a number of methods and properties, so one of those being back color. And we could assign that to be color.blue. And we could do a whole series of statements. If the user typed in the word orange, then we could set the form's background color to be orange, and so on. So it might be a better idea to actually use like a combo box rather than a text box, so that you can limit the number of options that the user has, so that you don't have to have a whole bunch of different if statements. Oops. Remember to do your double equal signs in your if control statements. Okay, so now I'm going to test this. And if I type blue, oh, my font, that was a weird font. I should change my font. But we can change the background color. If I type orange, changes to orange. Okay, we can do a similar thing with our other button. First, I'm going to go back to my text box and change the font on that. Okay, so if I double click this other button, I can use some similar code to change the color of the button. In fact, I'll just copy paste, but instead of referring to the form's background color, I'm going to refer to the button color button. Now if I save that code and run the application, so you can see that you can change the properties. The background color is just one example of a property that applies to all the different controls and forms, and you change it in the same way. Okay. Last thing I want to mention in this video before I jump over to my second video is just reviewing one more time the text property. We've been using this all term, but just a reminder that every control has a text property, including the form itself. So you might recall I showed this briefly at the beginning, but if you select your form rather than a specific control, the text property on that form controls what appears in the title bar. So if I type fun with colors in the text property, that's what will appear in the title bar of your application. The other thing that I wanted to note is that there is a shortcut. It's called an access key. So for any control that has a click method, like a button, if you put an ampersand symbol before one of the letters in the text property, that will create a keyboard shortcut for when you're running your application. So for example, if I click on this button and I put the ampersand sign before the C and hit enter, you'll see that it put a tiny little underline underneath that C. And then when we run the application, instead of clicking on that button, I can press Alt-C and it will do the same thing as pressing the button. And in the next video, I'll give you some code of how you can also use the enter key to be a shortcut for pressing the button. So if you're typing in a text box and you hit enter and you want something, a button, the same thing to happen as if the button's pressed, I'll give you the code for that.